The August heat in Beau Rêve, Louisiana, was a physical presence. It hung in the air like wet wool, thick and suffocating, turning the simple act of breathing into a conscious effort. Inside the sun, Landry Parish Moore, the electric hum of the refrigeration units and the slow, rhythmic sweep of the ceiling fan did little to combat the oppressive humidity. Dr. Arthur Morrow, a man whose neatness bordered on obsession, felt a single bead of sweat trace a path from his temple down his jaw. He ignored it, his focus absolute. On the stainless steel table before him lay Mr. Abernathy, a retired sugarcane farmer who had succumbed to a massive coronary that morning. The cause of death was obvious, the paperwork a formality, but Arthur's process was unchangeable. He was a man of science and fact in a town that often ran on superstition and hearsay. His world was one of cold, hard truths, of bodies that told stories only he knew how to read. They didn't speak of ghosts or voodoo. They spoke of clogged arteries, failing organs, and the simple, brutal mechanics of life's end. He had just finished his final notations when the screen door to the outer office creaked open, followed by the heavy tread of Deputy Miller. Miller was young, barely 25, with a face that hadn't yet hardened with the cynicism of his profession. He was a good deputy, but he loved to talk. "Evening, Doc," Miller said, leaning against the door frame, careful not to step into the examination room itself. He held a thin file in his hand. "Just bringing the final report on the Henderson accident from last week. Sheriff signed off on it." "Leave it on the desk, James. I'll file it," Arthur replied, without looking up, wiping his instruments with a practiced efficiency. Miller lingered. Arthur knew he would. "Hot one tonight," the deputy commented, stating the obvious. "It's August in Louisiana," Arthur said, his tone dry. "Were you expecting a blizzard?" Miller chuckled, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "No, sir. Just, it's the kind of heat that makes people do funny things. Say funny things." He shuffled his feet. "Speaking of which, Silas Blackwood is on his way to collect Mr. Abernathy." Arthur paused, placing a scalpel in its designated slot. "That is his job, James. I know. It's just folks have been talking again." Miller lowered his voice as if sharing a state secret. "You know about him. At the funeral home, Betty from the diner, her mama passed last month. She said when she went for a private viewing, late at night, she swore she heard him, whispering, not praying, she said, whispering right into her mama's ear as she lay in the casket." Arthur finally turned to face the deputy, his expression unreadable. "People grieve in different ways, James, and small towns have big imaginations. Silas is a consummate professional. He treats the deceased with more respect than most people show the living." "I reckon so, Doc," Miller conceded, though his eyes still held a flicker of morbid curiosity. "Still gives me the creeps. Talking to the dead. He prepares them for their final rest. Perhaps he's telling them it's all right. There are worse things." Arthur thought of the bodies he'd seen, victims of violence and tragedy. A quiet word seemed a kindness in comparison. "Now, if you don't mind, I have work to finish before Mr. Blackwood arrives." The deputy took the hint, offered a quick "Yes sir, Doc," and was gone, the screen door slapping shut behind him. Arthur stood in the silence, the hum of the machines suddenly seeming louder. He'd heard the rumors before. They ebbed and flowed like the bayou tide. Whispers about the town's solitary, somber funeral director, a man who had inherited the Blackwood and Sons funeral home from his father and ran it with a quiet, almost sacred devotion. Arthur had always dismissed the talk as nonsense, the product of grief-addled minds in a place where folklore was woven into the very soil. 20 minutes later, the long black shape of a 1949 Cadillac hearse pulled into the gravel drive. Its engine was a low, respectful rumble that cut off into silence. The driver's door opened and Silas Blackwood emerged. He was a man out of time, dressed in a perfectly tailored black wool suit despite the sweltering heat. He was tall and gaunt, with a face of sharp angles and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, holding a singular dignity that commanded a strange sort of respect. "Doctor," Silas said, his voice a low baritone, as smooth and cool as river stones. He nodded, his expression placid and solemn. He never used Arthur's first name. "Silas," Arthur replied, matching his professional tone. "He's ready for you. Everything is in order. Cause of death was cardiac arrest. Natural." Silas gave a slow, understanding nod. "He was a good man, Mr. Abernathy. Taught my father how to fish for bream in the Atchafalaya." He walked toward the gurney where the shrouded body lay. There was no fear or hesitation in him, only a profound sense of purpose. Arthur watched, as he always did, while Silas began his work. The funeral director's movements were fluid, respectful. He checked the identifying tag on the toe, then gently pulled back the sheet to look upon the old farmer's face. For a moment, he simply stood there, his head bowed slightly. Arthur was about to turn away to sign the release form when he saw it. It was almost nothing, a flicker of movement so subtle he nearly missed it. Silas leaned closer, his head tilted so his mouth was just inches from Mr. Abernathy's ear. His back was mostly to Arthur, but in the sterile light of the morgue, Arthur could see the faint, minute motion of his lips. There was no sound, not a single decibel to break the hum of the room, but the intent was unmistakable. It was the shape of a word, a phrase, a secret delivered from the living to the dead. The act lasted no more than 2 seconds. Silas straightened up, his face as impassive as ever, and began to carefully secure the body onto his own gurney for transport. He worked with practiced silence, his composure absolute. "I will take good care of him, doctor," Silas said, breaking the silence as he prepared to leave. "I have no doubt," Arthur managed to say, his voice steady despite the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He signed the release form and handed it over. Silas took the paper, gave one final, curt nod, and wheeled his silent passenger out into the thick, dark night. Arthur watched from the doorway as the hearse's taillights disappeared down the road, swallowed by the darkness and the heavy drapes of Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks. He was alone again, but the sterile certainty of his morgue felt compromised. Deputy Miller's gossip had been an idle curiosity, but what he had just seen with his own eyes was a fact, an observation, and it was a fact that had no logical place in his world. Sleep offered Arthur no respite. The image of Silas Blackwood, his tall frame stooped over the cold steel of the gurney, his lips moving in silent communion, was seared onto the back of his eyelids. For 2 days, Arthur found himself distracted, his focus splintered. He would be examining tissue samples under his microscope, and the perfectly circular field of view would morph into the O of Silas's soundless mouth. He tried to dismantle the memory with logic, his most trusted tool. It was a trick of the light, a flicker from the overhead fluorescent bulb casting a moving shadow. It was a facial tic, an unconscious habit born of stress, something Arthur himself might exhibit after a long week. Or perhaps Silas had simply been muttering to himself, a common enough practice for those who spend their days in solitude. Each rationalization felt hollow, a flimsy shield against an unsettling truth. He had seen what he had seen. His frustration mounted. He pulled the files for every death certificate he had co-signed with Blackwood over the past 5 years. The paperwork was, as expected, flawless. Causes of death were clear, timelines were precise, and every document bore Silas's elegant, decisive signature. There were no anomalies, no patterns, nothing to suggest anything other than the utmost professionalism. Silas Blackwood was a pillar of his trade, a man who handled the town's grief with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The evidence, the only thing Arthur ever trusted, told him Silas was beyond reproach. But the evidence of his own eyes told a different story. On the third morning, opportunity arrived not with a bang, but with the squeak of Deputy Miller's worn leather holster. He entered the morgue, a place he clearly detested, holding a small object pinched between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Mornin', Doc," Miller said, his eyes scanning the tiled room, avoiding the shrouded forms on the tables. "Cleaning crew found this near where we picked up that John Doe. Figured it was his. Thought you should have it in case family turns up." He placed a battered leather wallet on the edge of Arthur's desk. It was weathered dark with age and moisture, the stitching frayed at the corners. Arthur picked it up. It felt heavy, substantial. This was it, a legitimate reason, a perfect and professionally sound pretext to cross the threshold of Blackwood and Sons Funeral Home. "Thank you, Deputy. I'll see that it gets to the right place," Arthur said, his voice betraying none of the sudden quickening of his pulse. An hour later, Arthur parked his sedan across the street from the funeral home. It was a stately, two-story building of dark brick, with immaculate white columns and carefully tended gardenias lining the walkway. It didn't look like a place of business so much as a timeless, solemn residence that had stood for generations. Taking a steadying breath against the humid air, thick with the scent of magnolias and approaching rain, he walked up the path. The moment he stepped inside, the oppressive Louisiana heat was replaced by a cool, profound stillness. The air smelled of beeswax, polished mahogany, and the faint, sweet perfume of lilies. The silence here was different from the morgues. His was a sterile, functional silence. This was a heavy, reverent hush that seemed to absorb sound. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, its pendulum a slow, mesmerizing metronome marking time in a place where time had stopped for so many. Silas emerged from a doorway down the hall, not with a start, but with the fluid quietness that seemed to define his every movement. He wore a perfectly pressed black suit, his tie knotted tightly. His expression was one of mild, professional curiosity. "Dr. Morrow," he said, his voice a low baritone that suited the room perfectly. "This is an unexpected visit. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Mr. Blackwood," Arthur replied, holding up the wallet. "An officer brought this in. It belonged to the gentleman you collected the other day, our John Doe. I wanted to ensure it stayed with him." Silas's gaze fell upon the wallet, and for a fleeting second, Arthur thought he saw a flicker of something other than professionalism in his dark eyes, pity perhaps, or a deeper sadness. He took the wallet from Arthur's hand, his cool fingers brushing against Arthur's own. "Thank you, Doctor. It's a kindness to see to such details. A man's life, even one we don't know, is more than a file. It's in these small things." He gestured toward a small, ornate table near the entrance. "Please wait a moment. I will place this with his other effects." As Silas turned, the telephone on a desk in the adjoining office began to ring, a shrill, modern sound that was jarring in the otherwise timeless atmosphere. Silas paused, giving Arthur an apologetic look. "Excuse me, I must take this." He stepped into the office, leaving the door ajar. Arthur could hear his low, comforting tones speaking to a grieving family member. It was in that moment, left alone in the heavy silence, that Arthur's gaze drifted to Silas's main workspace. A large, mahogany desk that was as impeccably organized as his files. An open ledger lay upon it, the pages filled with Silas's neat, cursive script. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, overrode his professional decorum. He took 2 steps closer, just enough to read the open page. It was the record for recent arrivals. Near the bottom was an entry, Doe, John, male, approx, 60 minutes 65 hours. But it was the notes scrawled in the margin that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. They went far beyond any professional requirement. Hands heavily calloused, knuckles scarred, a life of hard labor, faded tattoo on forearm, anchor and rope. A sailor, far from the sea, skin weathered by sun, not by drink. He was a man who worked outdoors, a quiet dignity in his face, even in death. I will say a prayer for him to find his final harbor. Arthur stepped back, as if the words themselves had pushed him. This was not a clinical observation. This was an intimate, empathetic reconstruction of a life from the barest of clues. Sealers wasn't just preparing a body for burial. He was piecing together a story, creating a eulogy for a man no one knew. The whispering, it wasn't a nervous tick or a random muttering. It was this. He was whispering their stories back to them, granting them a final, personal acknowledgement. Sealers returned, his call finished. "My apologies, doctor. A difficult time for the Miller family." He noticed Arthur's gaze fixed on the desk but said nothing, his expression unreadable. "I should be going," Arthur said, his voice strained. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwood." "It is I who should thank you, Dr. Morrow," Sealers said, his gaze steady and deep. "For your diligence." Arthur walked out of the funeral home and back into the sweltering heat. The air felt thin, difficult to breathe. He had come seeking a logical explanation for a strange habit, and had instead found the heart of a profound, deeply personal ritual. The mystery of what Sealers Blackwood did in the quiet hours of the night was no longer about a strange action, but about the unfathomable depth of the man who performed it. The whispers were not for the dead. They were for the living, a way for Sealers to carry the weight of all that forgotten humanity. The sterile quiet of the morgue, usually a comfort to Dr. Arthur Morrow, now felt like a vacuum. The scent of antiseptic, a smell he associated with order and reason, did little to scrub the lingering image of Sealers Blackwood's ledger from his mind. On his steel desk lay the file for John Doe, case number BRE-50-47. The official report was sparse. Male, Caucasian, approximate age 55-65. Cause of death natural, a massive coronary event. Found by the bayou's edge. No identification. It was a neat, tidy, and utterly impersonal summary of a man's final moments. Beside the file was the worn leather wallet, its contents now catalogued. $17, a lint-covered pocket knife, and a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping of a ship christening from a decade prior. Impersonal artifacts. But Arthur wasn't seeing the file or the wallet. He was seeing Sealers's elegant script in the margins of his own private book. "A sailor, I think, far from the sea that was his home. Look at the hands, the stories they tell." The words echoed with a certainty that defied the cold facts on the coroner's report. Arthur, a man who built his life on verifiable data, found himself facing a hypothesis he couldn't ignore. The whispering was a ritual of empathy, yes, but was it rooted in anything real, or was it merely the romantic projection of a man steeped in sorrow? He had to know. The scientist in him demanded an experiment. Sealers Blackwood's intuitive deductions would be the theory. The life of John Doe would be the test case. His investigation was no longer about a strange ritual, but about the very nature of human perception. He began methodically, professionally. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and once again examined the body, which was still in his care pending identification. He focused on the hands. The calluses were thick and patterned, not the generalized toughness of a laborer, but specific ridges and hardened patches along the palms and fingers. He'd seen hands like these once before, on a fisherman whose boat had capsized near the Atchafalaya Basin. Consistent with handling ropes, nets, coarse lines slick with salt water. Observation 1, consistent with Sealers' theory. He made a note. Next, the tattoo on the forearm. In the harsh morgue light, it was a faded bluish-green blur. Arthur retrieved a large magnifying glass from his drawer, the kind he used for examining tissue samples. Under magnification, the shape resolved. It wasn't just a random design. It was a fouled anchor, its stalk and flukes clearly defined, entwined with a thick, stylized rope. At the base, almost lost in the aged ink, were two faint initials. TG. This was a significant piece of evidence. This was a starting point. He knew he couldn't trace it alone from his small office in Beau Rêve. The town was a world away from the bustling docks of a major port. He needed help. Swallowing his pride and a measure of his professional solitude, he picked up the telephone and dialed the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller answered on the second ring, his voice oozing a lazy afternoon drawl. Miller, it's Dr. Morrow. Arthur kept his tone clipped, all business. Regarding the John Doe from the Bayou, case 47. Doc, still got him on ice, huh? Any family come looking? No, and that's the issue. I've been re-examining the body for identifying marks. There's a tattoo, a fouled anchor with the initials TG. It looks like the kind a sailor or a merchant marine might have. I need to know if you can send a teletype to the port authorities. New Orleans, maybe Galveston. See if the description and tattoo match any missing persons reports filed with them. There was a brief pause. Arthur could picture Miller straightening up in his chair, a flicker of genuine police purpose cutting through his usual torpor. An anchor, you say? Well, now that's something. Yes, sir, doctor, I can do that. I'll send it out this afternoon. Initials TG, you said. I'll put that in the wire. Anything else? That's all for now, deputy. Let me know the moment you hear anything back. Arthur hung up before Miller could drift into small talk. He felt a strange sense of dissonance, using official channels to chase a lead that originated from a funeral director's poetic musings. The days that followed were trial in patience. The Louisiana heat pressed down on the town, slowing everything to a crawl. The air was thick enough to drink, and the drone of cicadas was a constant, maddening soundtrack. Arthur performed 2 other autopsies, an elderly woman who passed in her sleep, a farmhand from a tractor accident. He saw Silas Blackwood briefly at the hospital entrance during the second collection. The man nodded, a silent, respectful acknowledgement, his gaze as deep and unreadable as ever. Arthur simply nodded back, the unspoken question hanging in the humid air between them. He found himself studying Silas's own hands, long and graceful, and wondered what stories they could tell. Late on the third day, the phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the evening stillness. It was Miller, his voice crackling with an energy Arthur had never heard from him before. Doc, you there? I got something. Got a wire back from the NO Port Police an hour ago. They had a flag on a missing person report from a shrimping company over on Delacroix Island. Fella didn't show up for his birth 2 weeks back. Name's Thomas Guidry. Arthur's grip tightened on the receiver. TG and the description, he asked, his voice betraying nothing. White male, age 62. Has a tattoo of a fouled anchor on his left forearm. Been a merchant sailor and shrimper his whole life since he was a boy. A loner, they said. No local family. His last known address was a boarding house in the French Quarter. Sounds like our man, Doc. It really sounds like our man. Arthur felt a cold prickle run down his spine, a sensation wholly unrelated to the cool air of the morgue. It was the feeling of a carefully constructed wall of logic being dismantled, brick by undeniable brick. Thank you, Miller. That's excellent work. Please forward me the official report. He hung up the phone and sat in the profound silence of his office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He stared at the empty gurney where Thomas Guidry had lain, a sailor. Far from the sea, a man whose hands told the story of his life. Silas hadn't been guessing. He hadn't been projecting. He had, through some unknown, deeply human calculus of observation and empathy, seen the truth. Arthur had set out to solve the mystery of what Silas Blackwood did in the dead of night. Instead, he had only proven that the inexplicable was, in fact, real. The question was no longer if but how. And that was a far more unsettling mystery. The teletype message felt heavy in Arthur's hand, its flimsy paper weighted by the profound implications of its contents. Thomas Guidry, a name, a history, a life confirmed. Silas had been right. Not just vaguely right, but precisely, poetically right. The knowledge sat uneasily in Arthur's gut, a rebellion against the ordered, logical world he had built around himself. For 2 days, he went about his duties, the morgue's sterile silence offering no answers, only amplifying the question that echoed in his mind. How? He could no longer dissect this problem from a distance. Observation and evidence had taken him as far as they could. They had led him right to Silas Blackwood's door. On the third day, With a humid afternoon haze settling over Beau Rêve and sticking his shirt to his back, Arthur picked up the telephone on his desk. His finger hesitated over the rotary dial before decisively spinning the numbers for Blackwood's funeral home. The line clicked, and a familiar, low voice answered with a simple, "Blackwood. Silas, it's Arthur Morrow." He kept his tone level professional. "I'm calling about our John Doe. I've received confirmation of his identity." A pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of patient listening. "I see," Silas said. His name was Thomas Guidry, from a family just outside Humor. The New Orleans Port Authority had him on their rolls. He was a merchant sailor his entire adult life. Arthur let the words hang in the air, a baited hook cast into the silence. He was offering Silas an opening to say, "I told you so," or to express satisfaction. Silas did neither. "Thank you for letting me know, Doctor," was the quiet reply. "It's good that he has his name back." "Does he have family to claim him?" "A niece has been contacted. She's arranging to have him brought home." The conversation was slipping into procedure, away from the precipice Arthur wanted to explore. He had to act. "Silas, I was wondering if you might have a moment this evening. I'd like to finalize the paperwork and perhaps discuss the matter away from our respective offices. Would you be amenable to a cup of coffee at the Cypress Spoon? Say around 7. The silence that followed was longer this time, thick with unspoken consideration. Arthur could picture Silas on the other end, his posture ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. The Cypress Spoon was a neutral public space, a place for townsfolk, not for secrets. It was the perfect, disarming choice. Finally, Silas's voice returned, as calm as ever. 7 o'clock would be acceptable, Doctor. I will see you then. That evening, a thin drizzle began to fall, slicking the streets of Beau Rêve with a dark sheen that reflected the neon sign of the diner. Arthur arrived first, choosing a booth in the back corner, away from the gentle hum of conversation near the counter. He ordered a black coffee, the bitter aroma of familiar comfort. He watched the door, his nerves a tight coil in his stomach. This felt more critical than presenting evidence in court. This was an inquiry into the very nature of knowing. Silas entered precisely at 7, a tall, dark silhouette against the rainy street outside. He moved with a practiced economy, shrugging off his damp overcoat and hanging it on the rack before approaching the booth. He slid onto the vinyl seat opposite Arthur without a word, his gaze calm and direct. He didn't look like a man who held secrets, but like a man who was accustomed to their weight. A waitress came by, and Silas ordered a coffee, also black. When she left, the space between the two men was filled only by the clinking of cutlery from other tables and the soft hiss of the rain against the window pane. Arthur decided to start on solid ground. "The niece was grateful," he began, pushing a small folder across the table. "These are the last of the release forms. Everything is in order." Silas opened the folder, his long fingers scanning the documents with an unnerving stillness. He gave a single curt nod. "Good, he can go home." He closed the folder and placed his hands on top of it as if closing a chapter. Here it was, the moment. Arthur leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "When I was at your establishment, Silas, I happened to see your private ledger, the one for him, for Mr. Guidry." Silas's expression did not change, but Arthur sensed a subtle shift in the air, a gathering of focus. "It is a private record, Doctor, a way for me to organize my thoughts. You wrote that his hands were like old rope, that the sea had claimed his posture. You surmised he was a sailor." Arthur held his gaze. "You were correct down to the last detail. I'm a man of science, Silas. I deal in tangible evidence, in causes and effects that can be measured. What I saw in that ledger, it wasn't deduction. Not in the way I understand it." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Arthur's. He placed the cup back on the saucer with a soft click. "And what is it you believe you saw, Doctor?" "I don't know," Arthur admitted, the confession feeling both like a failure and a relief. That's why I asked you here. I'm not accusing you of anything. I am trying to understand. How did you know? For a long moment, Silas simply looked at him. Arthur braced himself for a denial, a polite but firm wall of privacy. Instead, the undertaker's shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction. You look at a body, doctor, and you see a puzzle to be solved, a cause of death to be determined, a name to be found. You search for the facts of their end. Am I wrong? No, Arthur said. That is my job. My job, Silas continued, his voice dropping into a more resonant, confidential tone, begins where yours ends. But I believe it starts sooner. When a person dies, the story of their life doesn't simply vanish. It's imprinted. On their hands, on their face, in the way their muscles have settled after years of use. Thomas Guidry didn't just have calluses. He had the deep, ingrained texture of a man who had spent 40 years pulling wet, heavy rope. His skin didn't just have sun damage. It had the specific leathery quality of a man who lived under a seaside sun, reflecting off the water. His shoulders were not just stooped. They were rounded in a way that spoke of leaning against the wind. He paused, looking down into his coffee cup as if the answers were swirling in the black liquid. I don't hear voices, doctor. There is no magic. I simply listen. I listen to the story the body is trying to tell. Most people are too busy with grief or procedure to pay attention. I give them that final courtesy, a moment of focused, complete attention. I piece together what I can to honor the life that was lived. It's a form of respect. Arthur was silent, processing. It was an explanation, but it explained nothing and everything at once. It was a philosophy, not a procedure, an art, not a science. It was empathy elevated to a forensic tool. And the whispers? Arthur asked, his voice barely audible. Silas looked up, and for the first time, Arthur saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. When I have pieced together what I can of their story, I tell it back to them, he said softly. It's a quiet promise that they are not just a body on a table, that they were seen, that someone knows who they were. So, yes, I told Mr. Guidry he was a sailor and that he could finally rest his hands. It's the last kindness I can offer. The simplicity and profound humanity of the act struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He had been looking for a trick, a secret system. He found a sacrament. The mystery of how Silas knew hadn't been solved by a formula, but by an entirely different way of seeing the world. Arthur's rigid, evidence-based reality now had to accommodate this new, unsettling variable, the tangible power of radical empathy. The humid Louisiana air, usually a constant, oppressive companion, felt different in the weeks following Arthur's conversation with Silas. It seemed thinner, as if the world he had defined with such certainty had lost some of its density. Science was still his bedrock, the unyielding foundation of his work, but now he was aware of a current running beneath it, an unseen, unquantifiable force of human experience that Silas navigated with such quiet confidence. Arthur didn't have a name for it, but he could no longer deny its presence. His newfound perspective was put to the test on a Tuesday afternoon when the familiar wail of an ambulance siren faded outside his door. Deputy Miller, his face grim and beaded with sweat, accompanied the gurney. On it lay the body of Elodie Thibodeaux, a young woman of 24, known in Beau Rêve for her vibrant watercolors of swamp irises. Tragic, dark. Just tragic, Miller said, removing his hat and wiping his brow. Husband found her. Looks like she missed a step on the back porch stairs, landed hard on the flagstones, necks broken. Clean and simple, but damn sad. Arthur nodded, his professional demeanor locking into place. He pulled the sheet back. Elodie was as still as one of her paintings, her face peaceful but for a slight bluish tint to her lips. He began his methodical examination, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, cataloging the obvious trauma consistent with Miller's report. The severe cervical fracture was undoubtedly the cause of death, an accident, open and shut. But as he gently turned her wrist to check for defensive wounds, a standard, often fruitless part of the routine, he paused. There, on the delicate skin of her inner arm, was a faint, geometric pattern of bruising. Not the mottled, irregular blotch of a fall, but something more defined. It was almost invisible, a ghost of an injury that didn't fit the narrative of a simple tumble. His mind catalogued it, but could not explain it. A week ago, he would have noted it as an anomaly and moved on, the primary cause of death being so clear. Today, it felt like a loose thread. He completed his report, listing the cause of death as accidental, but the word felt hollow. The image of the faint bruises on her arm remained, a question mark hanging in the sterile air of the morgue. That evening, long after Miller had left and the sun had bled out of the sky, Arthur sat at his desk, staring at the closed door of the cold room. The silence was absolute. He thought of Thomas Gidry, the sailor, and the story his body had told sailors. He thought of calloused hands and a life at sea. Elodie Thibodeaux's body also had a story. The official version was a short, tragic tale of a misstep. But Arthur felt an unnerving conviction that there was another chapter, one he couldn't access with his scalpel and microscope. He picked up the heavy black telephone, his hand hesitating over the rotary dial. He felt a flush of professional embarrassment, a sense that he was about to cross a line he had drawn for himself in stone. With a deep breath, he dialed the number for Blackwood and Sons Funeral Home. Blackwood, the voice on the other end, answered, calm and low. "Sealers, it's Arthur Morrow." He cleared his throat. "I have a new case, a young woman. The ruling is accidental, straightforward, but there are aspects I find inconclusive." The words felt foreign in his mouth. "I was wondering if you might have a moment to come by the morgue before you proceed with your arrangements." There was a brief silence on the line, not of surprise, but of consideration. "I will be there in 30 minutes, doctor." The click of the receiver echoed Arthur's own internal shift. He had done it. He had officially invited the town's whisperer into the heart of his sanctuary of science. When Sealers arrived, he brought with him the quiet solemnity of his trade. He gave a slight nod to Arthur and walked toward the gurney, which Arthur had pulled from the cold room. Arthur felt an odd nervousness, as if he were a student presenting his work for critique. Sealers didn't speak. He simply stood beside Elodie's body for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he moved with a tenderness that was profoundly unsettling in the clinical space. He didn't look for injuries. He looked for a life. He gently touched the fabric of her simple cotton dress, his fingers tracing the hem. He leaned close, and Arthur saw him inhale softly, not near her mouth, but near her hair, which was threaded with a few stray bits of dried grass. Finally, his gaze settled on her hands. He lifted one, his touch impossibly gentle, and turned it over. Her fingernails, neatly filed, were all intact except for one, the index finger on her right hand. It was broken, jaggedly near the quick. "She was not looking down at the steps," Sealers said, his voice barely a murmur. His eyes were still on her hand. "She was looking up behind her." He lowered her hand and pointed to her collar. "There is cedar here, not from a tree she fell into. It is the dust of old, dry wood, like a closet. And this," he gestured to the broken nail, "this is not from stone. This is from wood, from clawing at something, something she was being forced toward." Before Arthur could process the implications, the morgue door swung open, and Deputy Miller entered, holding a file. "Doc, forgot to have you sign the release for the..." He stopped short, his eyes locking on Sealers. A look of complete bafflement, followed by suspicion, crossed his face. What in the hell is he doing here? Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment of truth. "Mr. Blackwood is consulting," Arthur stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miller snorted, a harsh, incredulous sound. "Consulting on what?" "The proper embalming fluid. Doc, this is a closed case. An accident." "I have reopened it," Arthur said, the decision solidifying as he spoke the words. He met Miller's glare. "Mr. Blackwood has a unique sensitivity to details others might overlook. He has observed something I missed. "The tales," Miller scoffed, gesturing dismissively at Sealers. "You mean voodoo and ghost stories? Are you serious, Arthur?" Sealers remained perfectly still, a silent statue in the middle of their conflict. His presence seemed to amplify the tension. It was Arthur who answered, his voice dangerously low. "I am entirely serious, Deputy. Now, if you'll excuse us." Miller stared for another second, his mouth agape, then shook his head in disgust, slapped the file on a nearby counter, and stormed out. The door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence. Arthur turned back to the body, his heart pounding. He had defended the inexplicable, chosen intuition over protocol. Silas's words echoed in his head, clawing at something, old, dry wood. He picked up a pair of fine-tipped forceps and a magnifying glass. Carefully, he leaned over Elodie's right hand, focusing on the broken nail. Under the bright overhead lamp, nestled deep beneath the ragged edge of the nail, was something so minuscule he had completely overlooked it. A dark, tiny sliver of wood. It wasn't splintered like fresh pine. It was aged, dark, and flecked with what looked like old paint. He extracted it with surgical precision and placed it on a glass slide. It was a tangible piece of evidence, a physical clue born from an empathetic observation. He looked up at Sealers, who simply met his gaze with a look of profound, sorrowful understanding. The quiet hum of the refrigeration unit was the only sound, a low drone underscoring a terrible new possibility. The story of Elodie Thibodeaux was not over. It had just begun. The air inside the Thibodeaux house was thick and still, a suffocating blanket of stale perfume and pine salt. Outside, the Louisiana sun beat down with its usual midday fury. But here, with the curtains drawn, the world was reduced to dusty shafts of light, illuminating a scene of preserved grief. Jean-Luc Thibodeaux, Elodie's husband, sat stiffly on a plastic-covered sofa, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He was a man performing sorrow, every gesture practiced. "I appreciate you coming, doctor," he said, his voice a low, rehearsed murmur. "But Deputy Miller already, we've been through this." She tripped at the top of the stairs. Deputy Miller stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a monument to impatient authority. "Told you this was a waste of time, Doc," he grumbled, his gaze flicking between Arthur and the small, sealed evidence envelope in Arthur's hand. "The man's wife is gone. Let him be." Arthur ignored him, his focus entirely on the environment. He held up the envelope. "Mr. Thibodeaux, I found something during the examination. It's small, but it's important. A wood splinter lodged deep under your wife's fingernail." Jean-Luc's composure flickered, a slight tightening around his mouth. "A splinter? She must have gotten it when she fell. The banister, it's old." "Perhaps," Arthur said, his tone neutral. He walked to the staircase, running his hand along the smooth, lacquered oak banister. It was polished to a high sheen, seamless and solid. There were no rough patches, no missing slivers. He scraped a fingernail against it. "Nothing. This wood is sealed. Well maintained. The splinter I have is from untreated, aged wood. Cedar, I believe, from the scent." Miller let out an exasperated sigh. "Cedar? For God's sake, Arthur, are we investigating a death or building a damn cabinet?" She fell. "It's a tragedy. End of story." "The story ends when the evidence says it does," Arthur replied calmly, his eyes scanning the living room. He was a scientist in a foreign ecosystem, looking for the one element that didn't belong. His mind replayed Silas's words, not as a prophecy, but as a hypothesis. She was afraid. She clawed at old wood, not tumbling, not falling, clawing. A desperate defensive act. He moved past the silent husband and the fuming deputy, his gaze sweeping over the furniture. An oak bookshelf, a mahogany side table, nothing matched. His methodical search led him down the narrow hallway toward the back of the house. The air grew warmer, mustier. There were two doors. One led to a small bathroom, the other to a linen closet. "What are you doing now?" Miller demanded, following him down the hall. Arthur didn't answer. He reached for the closet doorknob, a simple brass fixture. The door itself was old, made of dark vertical planks of wood. It looked original to the house. He ran his fingers over the surface. It was rough, unfinished. The scent was faint but distinct, the dry, pungent aroma of old cedar. "Mr. Thibodeaux," Arthur called out, his voice sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. "Does this closet lock from the outside?" Jean-Luc appeared at the end of the hall, his face pale. "What? No, it's just a closet." "Why?" Arthur examined the frame. A simple latch was fixed to the outside, the kind one might use to keep a warped door from swinging open. He turned his attention back to the door's inner surface, near the edge where fingers would scrabble for a grip if it were being held shut. And there it was. He stopped, his breath catching for a single quiet moment. 3 faint, parallel scratches gouged into the wood. They were fresh, the lighter color of the raw cedar standing out against the aged, darkened surface. And just below the deepest scratch, a tiny jagged void in the wood, a missing sliver. "Deputy," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, devoid of triumph, filled only with grim certainty. "I need your flashlight." Miller, his irritation finally giving way to a flicker of professional curiosity, unclipped the heavy flashlight from his belt and handed it over. Arthur clicked it on, casting a bright, focused beam on the door. The scratches were undeniable. They weren't from a fall. They were the marks of a trapped animal fighting to get out. "The splinter I found," Arthur said, holding the beam steady on the missing piece, "is long-grained cedar, about a 1/4 inch long. It would fit perfectly right here." He looked from the damning marks on the door to Jean-Luc Thibodeaux, who now stood frozen, his carefully constructed performance of grief shattered, replaced by a stark, unnerving stillness. The air crackled. The quiet hum of the house was gone, replaced by the deafening weight of what was unsaid. Silas hadn't seen a ghost or heard a whisper from beyond the grave. He had listened to the story Elodie Thibodeaux's body had told, a story of fear and a desperate struggle inside a dark closet, a story that had just found its first chapter written in scarred wood. Miller stared at the door, then back at Arthur, his skepticism dissolving into the cold, hard reality of the evidence before him. He took a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster, not out of threat, but out of a sudden, chilling reevaluation of the entire scene. "Jean-Luc," the deputy said, his voice flat, all previous familiarity gone. "I think you and I need to take a ride downtown. We need to talk about how your wife really died." The air in the sheriff's office was stale, with the smell of old paper, sweat, and burnt coffee. It was a stark contrast to the thick, floral humidity of the Beau Rêve night outside. Through the doorway of the interrogation room, Arthur could see Jean-Luc Thibodeaux sitting at a small metal table. The man's expensive suit was rumpled, his face pale and slick under the single, harsh bulb hanging from the ceiling. Deputy Miller, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim determination, stood over him, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. "We found it, Jean-Luc," Miller said, his voice low and steady. He opened his palm, revealing a tiny plastic evidence bag. Inside, nestled on a piece of white cotton, was the cedar splinter. "The coroner found this under your wife's fingernail. It matches the wood from the inside of the closet door in your bedroom, the one with the fresh gouges in it." Jean-Luc stared at the splinter as if it were a venomous insect. He began to tremble, a subtle tremor at first that grew until his whole body was shaking. He had maintained his innocence for hours, weaving a frantic tale of a tragic misstep on the stairs, of a clumsy fall, of a life stolen by simple, cruel chance. But the splinter was not chance. It was a testament, a final, desperate message from Elodie. Arthur watched from the hallway, his arms crossed. He felt no triumph, only a deep, hollow ache. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was the wreckage of a life. Jean-Luc's carefully constructed composure shattered. A sob tore from his throat, a raw, ugly sound that filled the small room. I didn't mean to," he choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "She wanted to leave. Said she was going to New Orleans with or without me. She called me a failure, said this town was a cage. His voice was laced with the bitter poison of wounded pride. We argued. She was packing. I just wanted her to stop to listen to me. The confession spilled out, a torrent of shame and regret. In his rage, he had grabbed her, pushed her into the large cedar closet, and slammed the door. Just until you cool off, he had screamed. He had turned up the radio to drown out her panicked cries and furious pounding, stormed out of the house, and driven to the edge of town, his own fury a roaring engine in his ears. When he returned an hour later, the house was silent, horrifyingly silent. He had opened the closet door to find her slumped on the floor, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. The fall down the stairs was a panicked, clumsy act of theater, a desperate attempt to erase the truth of that small, dark space. Later, as Jean-Luc was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of vacant despair, Miller walked over to Arthur, pouring 2 cups of thick, black coffee. He handed one to the doctor. "I'll be damned, Doc," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You saw something we all missed. You and that peculiar funeral director." Arthur took a sip. The coffee was bitter, but it felt grounding. "Elodie saw it," he corrected softly. "She just needed someone to listen." That night, Arthur found himself driving not home, but toward the faint, solitary light emanating from Blackwood and Sons' funeral home. The cicadas were a deafening chorus in the oaks, a sound of timeless, indifferent life. He didn't have a pretext this time, no wallet to return, no questions to the skies. He parked and walked up the steps, the familiar scent of lilies and lemon polish greeting him like a quiet handshake. Silas was in the main viewing room, not with a body, but with a large bouquet of white gardenias. He was meticulously removing any yellowing leaves, his long, careful fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. He looked up as Arthur entered, his expression unreadable but not unwelcoming. "It's done," Arthur said, his voice feeling loud in the hallowed quiet. He confessed. Silas merely nodded, placing a perfected gardenia into the vase. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and profound. "You were right," Arthur continued, stepping closer. "She was afraid. She clawed at old wood because she was trapped. He locked her in a cedar closet." He finally said the words that had been circling in his mind for days, an admission that went against every one of his scientific instincts. "She told us what happened." Silas turned to face him fully, his dark eyes holding Arthur's gaze. "The body remembers what the voice can no longer say," he said, his tone simple, factual. It wasn't a mystical pronouncement, but a statement of truth Arthur now understood in his very bones. Scars, calluses, splinters, bruises, they were a language all their own, a language Silas had taught him to read. All these years, Arthur mused, looking around the immaculate, peaceful room. He looked at the polished caskets gleaming softly in the lamplight. They no longer seemed like mere boxes. They were archives, the final repository of a life story. The whispers. "The whole town thinks you're speaking to spirits." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Silas's lips. "People fear what they don't understand. They invent ghosts to explain the quiet." "You're telling them their own story back to them, aren't you?" Arthur asked, the realization landing with the weight of a final, settled fact. "The sailor who traveled the world, the young woman who fought for her life, that's the whisper. It is a final act of witness," Silas affirmed, his voice a low murmur like the rustle of dry leaves. He turned back to his flowers. "Every life, whether it's long and celebrated or short and tragic, leaves an imprint on the world. My work is to see that imprint for what it is, to acknowledge the truth of it." He paused, holding a single white flower. "It's the least they deserve, to be truly seen, one last time." Arthur stood there for a long moment, the weight of that simple, profound duty settling over him. Science provided answers, the how and the what. It brought men like Jean-Luc Thibaudot to justice. But Silas provided a different kind of closure. He offered empathy, a final, silent dignity that the law could never bestow. The coroner and the funeral director, The man of facts and the man of feeling were two sides of the same pursuit, uncovering the final truth. He left Sealers to his quiet work and stepped back out into the thick Louisiana night. The air was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur Mauro felt he could breathe clearly. The whispers in the dark were no longer a source of mystery or fear, but a quiet reminder that every life and every death has a story worth telling.